Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I must apologize for the seats. There are a number of broken seats in this venue, and because of the huge interest in today's speaker, we have this traffic jam. People will be helped to seats if you arrive late. It's my pleasure to introduce Richard Steyn, who graduated from Stellenbosch University, then practiced as a lawyer before switching to journalism. Some of you may know him as the editor of the Natal Witness in Pietermaritzburg. He was also a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and editor-in-chief of The Star, and has gone on to have a life in publishing, book reviewing, and writing, notably his books on Churchill and Smuts' relationship, as well as on Louis Botha and Jan Smuts. So he's well qualified to give today and tomorrow's lectures. Welcome to Richard Steyn.
Thank you very much, Vanilla, for that kind introduction, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me at the back? Is it all right? Good. It's a great pleasure to be back on home soil again and to see some young and familiar faces in the audience. I think it was Bernard Baruch who said that old age is always 15 years older than you are. And so most of us have got a few years to look forward to, but thank you for being here. The eminent Marxist historian Christopher Hill, master of Balliol College, once said that history has to be rewritten for every generation, for although the past does not change, the present does. And the facts do not change, the present does. And each generation asks new questions of the past. And the almost deliberate ignorance and condescension with which our first two prime ministers, Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, are treated by the present generation has encouraged me to revive memories of them, not only to recognize their achievements, also to reflect on their legacies, re-examine their legacies, both good and bad, so that we can learn from them and perhaps avoid some of the mistakes they made. My approach in trying to revive interest in the lives of Smuts and Botha has been to follow the British historian A.J.P. Taylor's advice to young and would-be historians: neither seek to justify nor to condemn the past, but rather to explain. History is so often clearer in hindsight than it is at the time of its making. So today's talk is about Louis Botha, South Africa's first Prime Minister, 8 years older than his great friend and ally Jan Smuts, whom we will discuss in more detail tomorrow. Let me give you some background. In late August last year, 2019, it was exactly 100 years since Louis Botha died. And when he was given the news, Winston Churchill sent this message of condolence to Smuts. He was one of the truly great men of the world, and thank God of the British Empire. Well, if Botha was indeed one of the great men of the world at that time, why is it that he's all but forgotten today? The answer, of course, as you well know, lies in the tangled politics of South Africa over the past century. Neither the Afrikaner nationalists, who succeeded Botha's great ally Smuts in power, nor the ANC has had any wish to perpetuate the memory of a man whose political policies conflicted for diametrically opposed reasons with their own. But during his lifetime, Botha was a man who inspired great respect and devotion amongst those closest to him, as well as other world leaders he met, but also animosity and hatred among fellow Afrikaners who once revered him, but then turned so viciously against him. First, a few facts about his birth and early years. Louis Botha was born in 1862 in the De Rust area near Greytown in what became the colony of Natal. He was the grandson of a voortrekker from the Swellendam area, and one of 13 children. And of course he was a subject of Queen Victoria's at birth, because Natal was under the sovereignty, if you like, of the British Crown. He had a tough upbringing on the family farm, cattle and sheep farm, where his father traded skins and wools in the days before there were railways or markets. Home comforts were few, and this Botha family, like all Boers, lived off the gun in order to feed off the abundant game, but also to keep at bay marauding tribesmen who objected to the white man's presence on their land. When he was only 7, his father Louis Sr. decamped to Vrede in the northeastern Free State, where in due course Louis Sr. became a prosperous farmer. Louis Jr.'s education was minimal. He learned what he could from his parents, his church, and the occasional itinerant teacher. And this lack of formal education was to be held against him in the future by some of his political opponents. As a youth, Louis was a fine specimen, tall, with an engaging smile and violet blue eyes. He had an easygoing personality, enjoyed playing the concertina, and he much preferred the company of others to solitary pursuits, and was very popular among his peers. Intellectually, he was instinctive rather than cerebral, obviously intelligent, but a man of action above all else. His sunny temperament, however, as his perceptive biographer Johannes Meijering points out, Johannes Meintjes points out, could not entirely conceal a certain lack of self-assurance and a sensitivity to disapproval or censure. His nature was such that he was easily hurt when others criticized or opposed him. The one core characteristic that he was to display throughout his life was an unswerving devotion to whatever cause he believed in. His word was his bond at all times. Within his large family, he displayed a quiet air of authority which made even his older siblings defer to him. And when his father died, the 20-year-old Louis offered to take over the family farms, the running of the family farms himself, but his siblings opted to sell them instead. Louis was dismayed and did what all young Boers did in those days. He inspanned his few oxen he had and drove off in his wagon. In this case, back to Natal once again to join his father's old friend Lucas Meyer, who was famous as the Lion of Vryheid. Well, in due course, Louis helped Meyer do a deal with the Zulu chief Dinizulu and founded the Nuwe Republiek of Boers in the Vryheid part of northern Natal. But in 1877, when the British authorities decided to assert their authority over the entire colony of Natal, including Zululand, the raison d'etre for the new republic fell away, and it became a district of Paul Kruger's ZAR. Louis Botha was now a Transvaler, and he was to remain a Transvaler for the rest of his life. By this stage, the 24-year-old budding businessman farmer had married a well-educated Irish Free Stater, Annie Emmett, with whom he was to have a long and happy marriage and 5 children. Some years later, now an established member of the leader of the Vryheid community, he was persuaded by Lucas Meyer to go into politics again, or to go into politics, and in 1897, just 2 years after the Jameson raid, he was elected to the Transvaal Volksraad. So with that as background, let me now turn to some of the highs and lows of Louis Botha's eventful career. As a young Transvaal MP, he had an uneasy relationship with Paul Kruger, the old Boer patriarch, who dominated the small 30-man Volksraad of the ZAR. There were no political parties at this time, but the vague division existed between Kruger's followers and those of General Joubert, the so-called progressives. It was rather like the Verkrampters and the Verlichters of 100 years later. Among Joubert's staunchest supporters were Lucas Meyer and Louis Botha. Botha was never scared to cross Kruger in debate. One of Kruger's tactics, if he couldn't get his own way, was to threaten to resign. And on one occasion, a mischievous Botha proposed that Beraat should accept Kruger's resignation. Well, after a fractious debate, Kruger withdrew his threat, and from then on was much more circumspect about threatening to go. But when negotiations between Milner and Kruger broke down in 1899, and the British began to strengthen their military presence in the Cape and in Natal, Botha was among the progressives who voted against. Botha was one of the progressives who voted against presenting an ultimatum to the mighty British Empire. But when it was decided to present that ultimatum, and the war loomed in October 1889, he and the entire Volksraad rallied behind Kruger. And Botha and Lucas Meyer immediately went down to the Transvaal-Natal border, where the Boers were mustering in preparation for an invasion of the British colony. Despite having no formal training, military training whatsoever, Botha turned out during the Anglo-Boer War to be a quite exceptional military commander. Time doesn't permit me today to go into detail about the war, but suffice it to say that first at the Battle of Tulana at Dundee, and then more particularly at Ladysmith, Botha displayed his acute tactical awareness, an uncanny gift, in the English journalist Edgar Holt's words, of ascertaining what was going on the other side of the hill. Defeat for the British Army at Ladysmith and the subsequent siege of the British garrison in the town at the hands of a badly dressed bunch of farmers was a major embarrassment for the imperial government, as you can imagine, and it made headlines around the world. There were an awful lot of people who were hoping that the British Empire or the British Britain would have her nose rubbed in the mud of Natal. Wisely, the British commander in Natal, Sir George White, had not positioned all his troops at Ladysmith. 2,300 men had been sent lower down southwards to the Colenso area around the Tugela River. They were all that stood between the Boers and Natal's capital, Pietermaritzburg. By this time, Botha's stock had soared among his fellow Boers. He was designated an assistant general and given a 2,000-strong commando to drive down through the Natal Midlands towards the port of Durban. But the ever-cautious commandant, the elderly Commandant General Piet Joubert, insisted on going along too, to keep an eye, it was said, on his young and dashing number 2. For the Boers, it was a race against time. General Redvers Buller, newly appointed to command in South Africa, and a large group of reinforcements were on their way from the Cape, about to land in Durban and make their way inland to relieve the siege at Ladysmith. And there were several armed skirmishes between the two sides along the railway line between Ladysmith and Colenso, in one of which the famous capture of WinstonChurchill, newly arrived on the scene as a war correspondent, took place. And if you read somewhere that it was Louis Botha who actually captured Churchill, as Churchill wrote in early years, in his book, My Early Years, it wasn't Botha. It was, that was a little bit of fiction that Churchill thought he'd get away with, and of course he couldn't. I think the man who captured him was a chap with a beard called Sarel Liebenberg. Botha was in overall command in the area, but he certainly didn't capture, Churchill at Colenso. But then fate intervened. Joubert fell off his horse and was severely injured, and further Boer advance on the port of Natal was called off, and Botha and his men, having captured plenty of animals and ammunition and supplies from the British, retreated to a defensive position above the Tugela. And as Thomas Pakenham puts it, the Boers had entrusted their most critical operations to the youngest and most energetic of their generals, who had shown himself by his raid on South Natal to be the most brilliant tactician thus far in the war. The incapacitated Joubert now put Louis Botha in full command above the Guerrilla. It was a very popular decision. One commando member wrote, "The influence that Louis Botha had among the burghers at that time was simply marvelous. The mere fact that he was in command and on the spot was sufficient to inspire the burghers with courage and confidence, no matter how despondent they may have been themselves." But what really cemented Botha's reputation, however, was the next and biggest engagement of the war thus far at Colenso. 2 months into the war, Buller had by now amassed a 20,000-strong army of infantry and supporting artillery. Somebody said 2 miles wide and a mile long, a mile deep, along the railway line on the southern side of the Guerrilla. Botha had a force of only 3,000 men, whom he deployed in concealed trenches on higher ground at 4 potential crossing points north of the river, and lay in wait. Well, Buller's plan went wrong from the outset. As his men advanced at various points along the river, they were routed by the virtually invisible Boers. And at 3 p.m. that afternoon, Buller was forced to announce a retreat after sustaining heavy casualties. Botha cabled triumphantly to Kruger, "The Lord of our fathers has given us a brilliant victory." In Britain, there was absolute incredulity at the Imperial Army's defeat by a bunch of part-time soldiers. You can imagine it was the biggest defeat they'd suffered since, I think, the Crimean War, if I'm not mistaken. Colenso was the third loss that the British sustained during 7 days in South Africa. The others were at Stormberg in the Eastern Cape and Marcusfontein outside Kimberley. The week was described by Arthur Conan Doyle as the blackest one known during our generation and the most disastrous for British arms during the century. In London, Buller was immediately replaced as commander in South Africa by Field Marshal Lord Roberts, aided by a second-in-command Major General Herbert Kitchener. Before Roberts could arrive, Buller made several more attempts to cross the river and establish a position north of the Guerrilla, the most famous of which ended, as you probably know, in the Battle of Spionkop. But Buller was thwarted and forced back time and again across the river by Botha and his men. And it wasn't long before Buller became known in the British press as the ferryman of the Guerrilla. Eventually, however, the sheer weight of British arms turned the tide of the war. Defeat at Marcusfontein and the relief of Kimberley meant that Boer reinforcements had to be rushed up from Natal to the Free State, severely depleting Botha's ranks in the colony. In the meantime, Buller had realized that the route to Ladysmith actually lay to the right of Colenso, not the left, and he began capturing the hills surrounding the besieged town of Ladysmith. On 5th of March 1900, Joubert announced that he was too weak to continue as Commandant General, and he wished to appoint Louis Botha as his chief assistant and second-in-command of the ZAR army. Soon after that, Joubert died, and a somewhat reluctant Kruger, who didn't really like Botha, announced that he would be succeeded by Louis Botha until such time as the people were able to make their own choice of Commandant General, which of course, as you know, never happened. Botha, still only 37, was the Boers' youngest general. His rapid rise through the ranks in the matter of a few months was thought at the time to be without parallel in military history. Thomas Millard of the New York Times, and there were not sizable number of foreign journalists watching this war at first hand, wrote of Botha, "Never have I encountered a more winning personality, a quality which greatly enhanced his influence with the independent spirits who comprised the Boer commandos." But the writing was on the wall by now for the Boer army. Roberts's forces captured and re-annexed the Free State and then the Transvaal. Kruger and his executive decamped down the railway line to Machadodorp, while Botha and his much diminished commandos attempted to hold back the khakis outside Pretoria, near Belfast, and then lower down the railway line to the border. After Kruger had departed for exile in Europe, Roberts decided that the war was, to all intents and purposes, over and went home, leaving Kitchener in charge. And Winston Churchill also went home to fight, to stand for Parliament, and narrowly lose in the general election of that year. Yet the war, as we know, was far from over. Knowing they couldn't win the war, couldn't beat the British, the Boer generals decided to embark on a guerrilla campaign which won them world fame, but would prove particularly costly for the British to counter and might encourage them to sue for peace. And that was the reason why Botha and Smuts and others fought on against desperate odds, unlike the Free Staters, Steyn and de Wet, who opposed any peace settlement whatsoever, arguing that surrender would be better, as the Boers might then be able to resume the battle later on without breaking any terms of a peace agreement. Kitchener by then had stepped up his scorched earth strategy of barbed wire fences and blockhouses, farm burnings, and internment camps for Boer women and children. He was impatient to end the war. He wanted to get to India, and in mid-1901 he asked for a meeting with Botha at Middelburg to discuss peace terms. The meeting was cordial. Kitchener is said to have taught Louis Botha bridge, which he played for the rest of his life, but Kitchener was under orders from Milner not to agree to restore independence to the two Boer republics. So the talks didn't go anywhere, and the Boers decided to fight on. Peace eventually came, as you know, in 1902, when the exhausted and ravaged Boers reluctantly accepted Britain's terms at Vereniging. And among those who spoke out forcefully at Vereniging were Botha, Smuts, Hertzog, interestingly enough, and most importantly, Koos de la Rey. There is talk of fighting on to the bitter end, de la Rey said, but has the end not come? It had indeed. And later that year, 1902, after going to Europe with de Wet and de la Rey to raise a little money for reconstruction, and they didn't raise much, Botha returned home to become de facto leader of Transvaal Afrikaners. And like Kruger, he held court on the front stoep of his house in Pretoria, dispensing advice and counsel, and where he could, aid to his demoralized people. Botha had no particular love of the British or their traditions, as his critics were to allege, but he was well aware of the attractions of the Transvaal mineral riches to foreign powers, particularly the Germans, and decided wisely, I think, on the basis of better the devil you know, to take advantage of the imperial link in order to unify white South Africans in the first place, and to build up the economy of what they saw as a white-led nation from which all races in the end would benefit. And of course he found a strong ally in Smuts, and together the pair embarked on a policy of reconciliation, of forgive and forget, under the protective umbrella, if you like, of the British Empire. In the Free State, Hertzog and Steyn, supported and others, went in precisely the opposite direction. Botha and Smuts complemented each other perfectly. Smuts was introverted and cerebral, excelled on putting pen to paper, which Botha was poor at. Botha was the better debater and public speaker. I beg your pardon, which Botha had, and Smuts was also the better debater and public speaker. But Botha had a shrewd political brain and was much better with people. He did much of the thinking and the strategizing. Smuts did most of the writing and the public speaking. Hancock writes that their partnership over the next 17 years was reinforced by bonds of mutual trust, loyalty, and love, such as seldom, if ever, united two political leaders. It was the importation of Chinese labour by Governor Milner and the landlords and the dismissive attitude of the British government in London to Boer Afrikaner objections that propelled Botha and Smuts into formal politics again from 1905 to 1907. And together they founded Het Volk, the people, to oppose the addition of yet another dimension to the Transvaal's already complex racial mix, but even more importantly, to campaign for self-government for the two ex-Boer republics. Het Volk based its appeal for unity not only on reconciliation between Boers and Britons, but this is important within Afrikanerdom itself, but between the many Hensoppers, the joiners, the National Scouts, who'd gone over to the British side in the Anglo-Boer War and had never been forgiven for doing that. And in the British general election of 1905, the same year in which Het Volk was founded, the Liberal Party defeated the Conservatives, and Botha seized on the opportunity to immediately send Smuts to London. And if you know your Smuts, you will remember how he helped persuade Campbell Bannerman and his colleagues, including Churchill, who was by then the Under Secretary for the Colonies, to trust the Boers and eventually to grant them self-government, which they did in 1907. Het Volk easily won the first election in the Transvaal, and the more popular Botha, rather than Smuts, became the Transvaal's first Prime Minister. And for the rest of his life, Botha, and Smuts for that matter, would feel a very deep sense of gratitude to the British government for allowing the Boers to recover to be awarded self-government. And not long after that, as you know, the National Convention took place in Durban, and as Prime Minister, Botha led the Transvaal delegation. If Smuts was the architect of union, Botha was the conciliator and the unifier of the four provinces. Many in the Cape and in Natal were mighty suspicious of the Afrikaner-led Transvaal, the Boer-led Transvaal, but Botha went out of his way to preach reconciliation and foster a spirit of harmony. He promised that the mineral-rich Transvaal would pool its assets in the interest of a united South Africa. English-speaking Italians in particular were beguiled by Botha, and Durban became the first city, in fact, to erect a statue in his memory after he died. A draft Union Constitution drawn up by the Convention was duly ratified by the four provinces and sent to the British Parliament. The African population, not surprisingly, reacted with anger and delegation, and sent a delegation, reacted with anger and sent a delegation led by W.P. Schreiner from the Cape to London to oppose it. And after the Act of Union was passed in Westminster, Schreiner predicted presciently that it would in fact become known as the Act of Separation rather than Union. Back in South Africa, the big question in 1910 was who would become the new Union's first Prime Minister. Well, it was a two-horse race between the relatively undereducated Botha and the Cape leader, John X. Merriman. Merriman was a highly experienced administrator and politician, and far better qualified. But the leader of the Transvaal, the country's richest and most powerful province, was always going to win. Governor General Gladstone asked Botha to form an interim ministry and to hold until the first general election could be held. As interim Prime Minister, Botha formed a coalition of all the interest groups, the South African Party, which duly won the first election, though Botha himself, interestingly enough, lost his own seat to Percy Fitzpatrick in Pretoria East and had to be given the safe seat of Losberg. And this was largely because of the animosity that Hertzog had stirred up amongst the English-speaking community in Pretoria. As you can see why Botha had to appeal to both sectors of the community in those days. As the British politician and journalist and early biographer of Botha, Harold Spender, was to write, the new Prime Minister faced a daunting task, having to reconcile two white races who had fought a bitter war only a few years ago. He combined the administration of four provinces, govern a black population 4 times as large as the whites with justice and sympathy as he had promised the British to do, and keep a balance between mine owners and farmers in the quest for cheap labor. There were 2 major developments in the early years of the new union which were to have a major bearing on the course of South African history. The first was the founding in 1912 of the South African Native National Congress, which became the ANC in 1923. And the second occurred 2 years later, also in Bloemfontein, when Hertzog, who feared that Afrikaners would lose their identity in a united white South Africa and had walked out of the ASAP by that stage, formed the National Party with the motto South Africa First, a slogan adapted and copied by the likes of Donald Trump. Another development at that time, which must be dwelt upon and will always cast a shadow upon Louis Botha's reputation, was the passing of the Native Land Act of 1913, for which he, as the Prime Minister and Minister of Native Affairs at the time, in succession to Hertzog, who had left his party, would always bear responsibility. The Act, as you know, confined black Africans to a mere 8% of the Union's land area. But the Act grew out of the Lagden Commission, the Milner's Lagden Commission of 1903-105, which recommended that after years of hostility, border wars and so on, whites and blacks should be kept apart in politics and on the land if future friction was to be avoided. And as Martin Meredith aptly comments in his book, the significance of Lagden was to elevate the practices of segregation throughout southern and colonial Africa into a political doctrine which no white politician could oppose thereafter if he, and it was only he in those days, wished to be elected. Like most whites, Botha believed paternalistically that black people should exercise their political rights in the tribal areas in which they lived. But the 1913 Land Act went much further than Lagden by outlawing sharecropping and forcing black males off white-owned land and onto the mines. The aim of the Land Act was to mobilize African labor for farmers and miners, and to keep down its price. And over the years, the Act has had a devastating effect on the lives of black people, curtailing their rights of ownership and tenure and converting them into an often underpaid, or always underpaid, class of laborers. It was then and now, a piece of legislation that can be explained but not defended, one that Botha and others thought reasonable at the time and necessary to grow the economy and reduce racial friction. Well, history was to prove them wrong, as we know, and the effects of the Act and subsequent discriminatory legislation are still with us 100 years later as we debate the pros and cons of expropriation without compensation. By far the major misfortune of Botha's political career, however, was the outbreak of World War I, so early in the life of the new Union. Imagine his personal quandary, his inner conflict. He and Smuts had promised the British if they had granted independence to the Boers, they could trust the Boers. South Africa had been given dominion status and was constitutionally bound to support the king. Yet Hertzog was on the warpath, and many thousands of Afrikaners were virulently anti-British, and proud, a large number proud of being pro-German. His dilemma was made much worse by Britain's immediate response to South Africa to invade German Southwest Africa and knock out Windhoek's powerful radio station, which was linked to Germany. Well, going to Britain's aid after little more than a decade after the Anglo-Boer War was bad enough, but to invade a neighbouring territory in which many Afrikaners had settled was to anti-Brits like the head of the UDF, General Beyers, simply a step too far. Yet Botha had given his word to the British government that it could count on Boer support. As I've said, there was no way that Botha was going to go back on his word. And the immediate result, of course, was the Boer Afrikaner Rebellion of 1914, which caused Botha more heartbreak than any other event in his life. Besides being Prime Minister, despite being Prime Minister rather, he led the UDF commandos into the field himself to put down the rebellion, which he accomplished at great cost in human life, but at enormous harm to his drive for white unity. Sadly, I think Botha had seriously underestimated the strength of the Afrikaner revolt against his toenaderings to the British. From putting down the rebellion, it was on to Southwest Africa, where Botha, often mounted on a white horse, again took personal charge of the UDF's, Union Defence Force's, three-pronged invasion of the German-held territory in the most dry, sandy and waterless conditions imaginable. And thanks to another brilliant tactical campaign and the mobility of the UDF forces, which they learnt, of course, in the Boer War, he forced the Germans into surrender in July 1915. Botha was, in fact, the only Allied Prime Minister to actually go into the field in the First World War. Returning to South Africa, he was given a hero's welcome, but his sensitive soul was deeply troubled. It was English-speaking South Africans who were celebrating South Africa's triumph, the first major Allied victory of World War I, and not his own Afrikaner people. The vilification of Botha and Smuts in the bitter general election of 1915 caused the rift between the two white races in South Africa to widen. The issue at stake was whether South Africa should continue to support Britain against Germany. As the leader of the SAP, Botha crisscrossed the country preaching reconciliation without really recognizing or coming to terms with his loss of support in the rural platteland. The SAP lost seats to the nationalists in the election and needed the support of the English-inclined Unionist Party to keep parliamentary control of the country. Botha seriously considered resignation at that point, but was persuaded by Governor General Buxton and others to soldier on. As World War I dragged on, Botha's health began to deteriorate. Because of ill health, as well as the threat of another rebellion, he couldn't go to the Imperial Conference of 1917, but sent Smuts himself. And as you know, Smuts was welcomed with open arms and invited to join the Imperial War Cabinet. Now in visibly poor health, Botha struggled through the 1918 parliamentary session. He became very depressed, believing that, like his father, he had only one more year to live. On the 11th of November of that year, World War I, surprisingly, unexpectedly came to an end, and Botha was summoned to London and Paris as part of the British delegation to the Versailles peace talks. He was eager to go, and his physicians thought that a long sea voyage might do him good. At Versailles, Botha made a highly favourable impression on Allied leaders, especially the British Prime Minister Lloyd George, whom he'd met in 1907 in London. Lloyd George recorded that of the three noteworthy men present who had negotiated a peace in South Africa 17 years earlier, Botha, Smuts and Milner, Botha was the most striking personality in terms of his physical appearance, his strength of character, and in his general impressiveness. He was one of those men, Lloyd George said, whose presence you feel in a room even when they are silent. He attracted attention without making any effort to do so. And one of the most moving moments of the peace conference came when Botha rose to support his old enemy, Milner, which is now Britain's colonial secretary's plea that the Germans should be treated with magnanimity rather than over harshness in the terms that were being negotiated. Recounting how Britain had helped the Boer people to rise again after their defeat, he warned delegates not to take vengeance on a whole people and make it impossible for them to recover and rise again. It was a moving appeal that regrettably went unheeded. But Woodrow Wilson, the American president, told Lloyd George afterwards that it was the most impressive speech he'd ever heard. I quote, "The long sea voyage back home failed to restore Botha to health, and he is said to have suffered a minor heart attack while on board ship. He had been away for 8 long months. Back home, he said he felt much better, and during an arduous round of welcome home functions, he told a large crowd at the Union buildings that so long as the country needs me, I shall continue to serve." Well, alas, it was not to be. While paying a quick visit to his farm Rusthof en route to Natal, he was laid low by a strain of the 1918 Spanish flu, and he died at midnight on the 26th of August of 1919, just a few days short of his 57th birthday. There was an eloquent tribute from a devastated Smuts, and now the Prime Minister, described Botha as his greatest friend and the largest, most beautiful and sweetest soul of all my land and days, the equal of Kruger among Afrikaners. Botha didn't want a state funeral and was laid to rest without pomp and ceremony in the new Rebecca Street Cemetery in Pretoria, not in the hero's acre of the Boers as he was entitled to be buried, an occasion sadly boycotted by many Boers. Some years later, the British journalist and author H.C. Armstrong said the following: "When Botha died, there went away a great man. Many men had greater capabilities and greater virtues, but there was about Botha a majesty which all felt but none could explain, by his looks or what he said, or even by what he did. But it came of some greatness in the man himself." And in his last years on earth, Botha had become very close to Governor General Sidney Buxton, who wrote of him, "Unaffected, modest and assuming, he combined natural simplicity with inherited shrewdness. He was at once both wise and simple, with a refreshing fund of common sense. He possessed in a marked degree personality and character, which are of the essence of greatness." Louis Botha, in my estimation, was just as much a patriotic Afrikaner and nationalist as Steyn and Herzog, his opponents. But he believed, unlike them, that the future and the long-term survival of the Afrikaner people lay in unity with others rather than narrow isolation. And the people whose interests he had closest to his heart condemned him for that. As hindsight makes apparent, Botha and other nation builders of 100 years ago faced challenges which we can only contemplate with awe today. They were often victims of demographic, economic, social and cultural forces they couldn't even fully comprehend or were indeed aware of. So let's not, ladies and gentlemen, a century later, judge them by today's standards and look down on them, measuring them by our values and our standards. Let's rather try to appreciate the difficulties they faced, comprehend why they chose to act as they did, and grant them a humanity that they did not always, let's be frank, extend to other races. Tomorrow we will talk about a far more complex character, Botha's political partner and tough-minded successor, General Jan Smuts. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions for Richard?
Or comments?
Additions?
Sir, Mr. Maggott.
For me, you've told us a great, recognized speech at the first
Don't worry, I can hear.
He made a great speech at the First World War peace.
Yes.
I assume he spoke English.
No, I don't think he did. He was very scared of... This is why I have a little skepticism about Woodrow Wilson's claim. Botha, although he spoke good English, and he spoke both at home because some of his relatives were English, married into English homes, he was always embarrassed about his English in public. So he always had an interpreter with him, a Dr. Bock, who was, I think, Secretary of the Transvaal at the time. So it wouldn't have been in English. It would have, I think it must have been translated. There was one very funny occasion in Britain. He was talking to some important club, the League of Empire Loyalists, and it was the time of the suffragettes. And Botha got up to speak, and Dr. Bock came up to help him, or translate for him. And the security people assumed that this was one of the suffragette supporters who were coming to, so they grabbed Dr. Bock and hustled him out. But it was rather, anyway, they sorted it out. But according to the report, the audience was so convulsed by this that they hardly listened to a word that Botha said after that. They found the incident so amusing. So he did speak largely in Afrikaans and have a translation by Dr. Bock. Thank you, Alan. So, anybody else? Sir?
Has his reputation and status changed over the decades among the Afrikaans-speaking parties?
Look, there's still this division in Afrikanerdom to this very day. The schism is still there. Although, I mean, given what's happened to South Africa over the last 20 years, all I can tell you is that academically people are starting to look, historians are starting to look again at Smuts particularly, but also Botha, because they understand that we're all in this together now, and that the older visions of the past are, no longer make sense. But instinctively, I think the two camps are still there. You were either a Smuts man, or Botha, then a Smuts man, or you weren't. And those divisions you still come across to this very day. Sorry, there's one at the back there.
Yes, I knew his son, Johnny, who was his adjutant during the war, and served him loyally throughout. But he died a pauper because his father had left all his wealth to the state.
I wasn't aware of that. Is that true? Right. That's most interesting. I didn't know that. Thank you. Sir?
In the choice of the first Prime Minister, I know that the Cape Man had a lot of anti-support, shall we say.
Yes.
But I believe Steyn was also favoured, but his health was against him.
No, Steyn's health by that stage was bad. He'd been in Europe for 3 or 4 years, come back. He was engaged in Free State politics in the background, pushing Hertzog forward, but he was not in contention as Prime Minister because of his health. He would have been, but he wasn't. Yes, Rose.
Richard, I told Richard this morning I was reading Emily Botha's letters last night, and President Steyn sent her to Louis Botha. She used to stay in his house to instruct him he had to take the premiership, and she told him, and she says he wept. He did not want to do it.
Well, I don't think he did.
Well, not only because Steyn was so insistent, he was the man.
Botha wanted to farm. He really wanted to go back to the farm. He wasn't a military man. He wasn't an instinctive didn't enjoy politics particularly, but he had this sense of service. And the mantle of Afrikanerdom had descended upon him, and he was doing what, he felt he had to. That was his sense of loyalty. Are we done? Thank you very much. I hope to see you tomorrow.